Well, what's going on, y'all? We are back with another episode of the Preaching Collective, and this time we are talking about speak.
Hey now.
We've been doing the blessed rhythms, and now we're talking about speak. So,
speak on it.
Speak on it.
Say something.
Hey, say that.
I was. That's what I love. Being in a black church, where they're like these sayings that they say. Say that, preach it.
Right.
Come on now.
Book.
I was actually at this event, and they were talking. The pastor was preaching, and the guy was in the back like, "Build your case, Doc. Build your case. Build your case."
Yes.
Anyways, so speak.
Where was this at?
It was a Baptist convention, the black version, and
That's funny.
anyways, it was funny.
The black version.
But speak. So obviously, this is one of the things that I think is interesting, and obviously, when we look at the Bible, there's this proclamation, there's this preaching, there's just like words you have to communicate to people, right? And there's many different like passages that talk about speak. But one of the things that I'm always struck by, I guess to kind of start off, like, what are the ways that we should not speak? Like before we get into like how should we, what does that look like? Like, what are the bad ways that maybe in our own experiences that we've seen people speak? And I just want to start there, right? So one story I have is I have a bunch of different stories of how Christians have done this poorly, but one story that I have is this one guy, and he was kind of one of those dogmatic people, very very like this, like, this is how it has to be, very black and white. And he was I guess, street preacher, I guess that's what that was. And he was as people were walking by, he had his little tracts that he was kind of giving out. And he also was telling people, "You're going to hell." So that was like the opening. that was his introduction. You're going to hell. And then some people would stop and be like,
that escalated quickly.
"Oh, like,
Yeah, right?
And then from there, he went on to say, well, and then he would get into, God loves you, this, that, and the fourth. But his hook was more so like, you're going to hell. And kind of like the fire brimstone type of posture. And for a lot of people, they just ignored him, walked by.
He thought he was just preaching the gospel, though.
Right.
I mean, that's one aspect that some people would probably say that they're speaking, right?
Yeah, that's one way.
So anyways, this particular guy, like, that's one thing. And I don't know, I'm not really too fond of that approach. That approach actually turns people away. But what about you guys? Like, what are some bad experiences that you've had people speaking?
There's too many to count.
I know.
Well, I mean, if I could sort of take one even a step back, I think what the framing for this for me is there's bad ways to speak because God has told us to speak and has told us how we should speak and ways we should speak.
Yeah.
Right. It's the reason. And I like to tell people, like, if you're a Christian, you're going to follow God, you're going to believe in Jesus. You can't just say whatever you want to say, however you want to say. Pick a different religion, right? If you want to say whatever you say, how you want to say. There are constraints on us. Yeah. Because the Lord wants us to. There should be. We can speak in all sorts of ways, and sometimes it can build people up, or sometimes it can tear them down. Yeah, sure. To be a Christian, God is a creator. He speaks to create, to bless, to edify, to flourish. So that's why we should. That's why this is a good question. Okay, so what do we want to do? How do we want to speak such that it leads towards what God wants and doesn't sort of take away from what God's trying to do? Yeah. So as a broad tent for me, it's ways in which we. I just really still feel strongly about this. I think. Ways in which we speak that sort of mimic the way the world is, and particularly the negative ways the world speaks, which tends to towards right now, like especially like in places like Twitter, things like that, sarcasm, bitterness, harshness, confronting, to own the other side, that type of thing. All those ways, I would say, we're called to speak, but not in those ways because of how they tear people down, how they deny people being made in the image of God, how they're often about elevating ourselves at the expense of others. Those are some of the sort of big examples, big categories I think of when I think of how should we not speak.
Yeah, I think one of the troubling things I think about
in an age where people are, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of language that's out there now that to the untrained ear, I guess that's the way to say it.
Untrained in the sense of like not having the seminary knowledge or
not necessarily that. It's just like, it's more Hebrews, those who have trained their senses to know the difference between good, like through practice. And so to an immature ear, you hear the language of, healing, therapy is super popular, mental wellness, and speaking your truth.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that becomes troubling to me in a time like this is in a season where we're talking so much about health, there's a lot of ways that people are encouraged to speak in a way that's really unhealthy under the disguise of speaking my truth. This is healthy for me. And so because the idea of health and progress and therapy and wellness has all been individualized, it's interesting because my wife is in the healthcare industry, and so she reads a lot of books. And so then I find myself reading these books because we get into these conversations. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Let me read this book. So I'm reading a book about complex trauma, which is a thing people are talking. They're not talking about it like that, but they're talking about trauma, and they're trying to connect to all these things that have happened in their childhood. And the thing that's interesting, and we just had a real conversation about this last night, yesterday, is the ways that what you would typically hear when it comes to trauma situations is often what happened between a child and a parent. The thing that was the most interesting about this book, and that affects everybody, is the way that relationships affect us regardless, children and adults. And so when you hear the term complex trauma, it's about how relationships affect adults. And that's not just when you're a child. Now, again, the child's relationship with their parent matters, but that child's relationship with other individuals in their sphere matter also, right? And so now with everybody connecting to all these things that have happened throughout their life, it's almost as if there's a stream of language that's saying like, almost like pull back and pull in and find the answers within yourself, forgetting the fact that everything is still relational, right? And that's the thing about the complexity of that trauma. It's like, no, it isn't just about you at home and what happened when you're a child. Now you can figure it out. Now you got to speak your truth. I go, no, things don't stop being relational. That's not going to stop. And so if everything turned into, well, I'm just speaking my truth, I go, that's not a thing. You know what I mean? And so then you say what you feel is right because in that moment you feel like, well, this is right for me and this is where I'm at, et cetera, and you don't take into account the people that you're interacting with and how it might affect them. I think it creates an unhealthy culture that people don't realize they're creating. And so it just perpetuates the trauma that they're trying to heal from. You know what I mean? Like you're pursuing healing while hurting at the same time. And it just doesn't create the environment that you want.
that's good.
And so in regards to like a way that people are speaking that actually isn't helpful, I think that's one, especially when they're trying to be.
Yeah. I think like along those lines, because the Bible is clear, like death and life are in the power of the tongue.
Say that.
Right? Death and life. Like, and we always say it the opposite way, life and death. No, it's clear. Death comes first because that's our tendency is we are prone to like go to negative and to, and I appreciate when you preach the message, you actually started like sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But that is so far from the truth because you see so many people, the things that you say can literally plant a seed and just like that will be the drive. That'll be the underlying. Yeah. It absolutely grows. And so, we have a responsibility with our tongue to really like guard what we say. There are people who commit suicide. There are people who, you know what I mean? Like just struggle with so many things just based off of something that we say.
Yeah.
And so we have a bigger responsibility.
Huge responsibility.
So what are some of those ingredients? And Pastor Ramon, you alluded to the idea of like the approach and how. Like you can't just speak how we want to. We can't just speak the truth that we. So what are some of the ingredients that Scripture kind of talks about in terms of how we should speak? One of the things that I think about is I think Ephesians talks about. Oh, you was going there?
Yeah.
Hey, great minds think alike, brother.
Okay.
You could just say I taught you well.
Yeah, wow, man.
Speak on it.
Build your case, Doc.
Build your case.
Build your case, Doc.
So Since we're great minds, what verse was I thinking of?
Ephesians 4:29.
Whoa,
Was it
okay.
right on? Uh-oh.
Hey man,
Bullseye.
discipleship hashtag.
Build your
Ephesians
case, Doc.
4:29. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So yeah, we're talking about just blessed rhythms, speak as a rhythm, and which is to say that we are calling people to speak, but not in the ways we tend to. Here's a way to do so, and again, it begins by saying no corrupting talk. So that's our tendency to speak talk that like eats away at people's hearts and souls.
Negativity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the Lord, we can actually do something way. We don't have to do that. We can do something like this: build people up, give grace to those who hear. Which I take to say, does it mean that we should ignore stuff that's happening?
Yeah.
So we shouldn't take this as saying like, okay, there's things happening and we shouldn't say anything because people might take it wrong. It's how we say it, what we say.
Yeah.
So we want to speak in ways. In other parts of the Bible talks about speaking the truth with love. So we want to speak in ways that builds people up. So that helps people have healthier marriages and families. That helps people grow spiritually, emotionally, relationally. To do all these different things. And grace, I love that part of it. But give grace to those who hear. Grace is that sense of undeserved favor. That there's words we can give that shows favor towards people. That shows goodness to people. And again, that meets people where they're at and takes them to where they need to be. So this is to say that doesn't mean a measure of thoughtfulness, of intentionality, of looking into people's lives and saying, what can I do that helps them be who God intends them to be? What can I say, I should say, that helps them be what God intends them to be?
I think people need to pay more attention. When Amy was on these last episodes, speaking of, if you haven't caught those, they're on the channel.
They on the
See
channel.
that big red button right there that says subscribe? If it's red, that means you haven't yet. You should hit that button. Be subscribed. There's a little bell by it. Hit that. You'll get notified whenever we send new episodes out. But on that episode, she talked about being a part of this prayer group and the way that they would have people pray for each other. They would go on walks and pray in the presence of another for themselves. So they're praying for themselves as another is with them, listening to them pray for themselves. The ways in which they would have people speak on behalf of someone else, like practice the idea of like speaking blessing or speaking a prayer. And that idea I thought was sort of really intense, but in order to do that well, it means that while you're together, you're paying attention.
Yeah.
So Vermont even just mentioned having a degree of intentionality, like having intention. You see people and you just watch, like, so you think about James when he says, wherefore be slow to speak and quick to listen. I think in that sense, it's like observe more, just watch what's going on, look at people, see what's going on. And then when you speak, it's more meaningful in that sense. Even then when you think 1 Corinthians, and I don't want to open up a can of worms, but 1 Corinthians 14, when it talks about the difference of somebody walking in a room full of people praying in tongues. He goes, if somebody walks into that room, they don't understand a thing any of y'all are saying, they're going to think you're crazy.
Yeah.
But if they walk in that room and the people in there can draw out the secret matters of their heart, they're going to say, God is in your midst. And that's the entire point of it.
Yeah.
Right. So as a blessed rhythm, you would think, hey, I'm speaking to you. So even that, the idea of like, showing grace to others, it's still an extension of the grace God has shown us. So it's like, I'm going to pay attention as someone that I know bears God's image, when I do speak, even if it's a situation of correcting. There are situations where I'm talking to somebody and they're just the way that they might talk about themselves, the way they might talk about their life because of some trauma and past experiences, where you can say, no, but that's not true though. That might be a situation that has happened, but that doesn't mean that's who you are.
And you may even feel that way, but just because you feel that way doesn't mean that
it doesn't mean that's the truth.
Yeah,
you see what I'm saying? So somebody be like, well, I'm just speaking my truth. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that that's true. Yeah. Right? There are still a lot of things to consider. And as I watch you, let me just say this, if I might. Right. And so it's in certain cases, I think sometimes when we think about speaking in some of these terms that are gracious and seasoned with salt, it feels soft all the time. Yeah. And again, as fits the occasion, maybe it should be. But I think in other cases, speaking the truth in love still is a means to bless someone confidently, right, and deliberately, even in a way that might be rebuking them, and with as much grace and like care as possible, so that at the end of the day they go, oh no, God was here, God was in the midst. Something about that struck the chord that it should have for me to reconsider and turn back to God.
So Colossians just goes along with what you said. Colossians 4:6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And so what you're saying just strikes me that just how much this rhythm speak. You might say that the rhythm hidden underneath speak is listen, right?
Yeah.
That speak doesn't work without listening.
Right.
So to know how to answer each person, we want to have speech that is directed and specific to answering the people wherever they're at, wherever they need, whatever the question or doubt or concern. So the sense of caring enough about the people in our lives to speak into their lives. But to do that, we need to listen. So we know how we ought to speak. So we know, so we can speak wisely as opposed to foolishly. We can speak distinctively, right? Seasoned with salt, as opposed to speak sort of just randomly, just to
Generically,
right?
That's good.
So they're sort of particular for them, again, for the building up of that person. And it's also to say then that God gives us the eyes to see that and the ability to do that. That God, by his Spirit, does give us insight into one another. We're in a relationship with each other such that we can speak words that actually do help us, ways that we need to be helped.
Yeah.
I feel like people need to hear that though. Like, we all bear God's image.
Yeah.
Like, holy nation, chosen people,
Royal priesthood.
like the fact that like we are people who are intended to be a conduit between the world and God, like royal priesthood. All of you, like all of us, have that spirit. And I don't know often if we walk with that kind of identity, that kind of reality, to know like, oh, I know this is what I'm here for. I'm supposed to be doing this. So to think of speak as a blessed rhythm, it's like, oh no, that's the intention. I see somebody and it's like, hey, if I can help unlock something to get you closer to God, to help you understand the reality of who you are before God, created by God, bearing his image, whether you believe in him or not, like to think that sort of thing and go, oh, every single individual, if you believe God, if you follow the Messiah, this is what you do.
Yeah.
This is who you are. This is your heritage. Like to think in that regard, I go, man, I think people should hear that.
Yeah, that's good.
That actually goes back to Colossians 3, and I pull that one up when it talks about, but now put away all the following: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and filthy language from your mouth. But I think because of our culture, because of how we live, we don't listen to people. Like I think it's this practice that we need to. It's just a practice. I feel like it's okay to sit and listen to someone else, as you were talking about when we were doing the prayer walk. Like it's okay, like to sit and listen. Like, does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
But in that, it was talking about how we're being renewed by the knowledge according to the image of our Creator. Like it's a practice, it's a rhythm. Like we don't have to feel condemned by it or feel like, we're gonna get it wrong sometimes. But this culture is just so counterculture to what God is, requiring us to do. So,
I would say even more than counterculture, I feel like it transcends culture. I feel like culture is going to be where it's at. And it's almost like a baby it's just like babies are going to do what they do. They're going to like go with the stream, and that's where they're at. I feel like the things so think Paul talking to the Corinthians when he says, why are you acting like mere men? Fighting against each other, and like you got all this discord. He goes, you're acting merely human. Yeah. And I feel like I read stuff like that and I go, I don't know if we always feel the weight of that. Right? You're taking each other to court and you don't know that one day y'all are gonna judge angels. You don't know one day you're gonna inherit the earth. Like, what are we talking about? Y'all suing each other? What are we talking about? So we talk about listening and like being intentional with one another. It's just like culture's gonna be like, speak your truth. And I go, that's fine. Yeah. But then when you sit with a Christian, if you sit with somebody who can draw out the secret matters of your heart, you're gonna go, bro, there's something different about y'all. Yeah. I get around y'all and it's different. Yeah. And it's to that you go, it's a different thing. I go, that's the Spirit of God. That's the thing that I think, call it prophecy, what Paul's talking about. He goes, that's the gift I want all of y'all to get. Because it's not about like, I got this gift. It's if I unlock that thing inside you and you go, yo, that's what God is. Yes. Yeah. And you meet him that way. It doesn't matter who the conduit, like the means by which life. That's why Paul's like, Who cares? Like Cephas, Apollos, it doesn't matter. It goes, because if God is providing the increase, that's the point. You know what I mean? So if I can say the thing, if you can say the thing because of listening, presence, and that thing unlocks and somebody goes, oh, and they wake up, I go, that's the win. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was just agreeing. Like it takes some intentionality, like Pastor Ramon was saying, and some practice. Like you can practice it. Like it's
Oh, that's real.
So
in these rhythms.
Yeah, it was one other thing I was going to add. You go first.
I was going to give it. So far we talked about the bad experiences and how not to do it. We talked about some ingredients in terms of grace, paying attention, intentionality, mercy, truth, firmness, all these types of ingredients in terms of the approach and how seasoned with salt. And then I was going to say in terms of like, so what's the best way? I guess not the best way, but like the idea of like the application of like one of the best ways that we can bless people is to tell people actually about Jesus.
Yeah.
So I was going to go there and just say,
I was thinking the same thing.
hey man, it's kind of one of them things.
Y'all are such
one of those things.
You're preachers. Go on, Reverend. Build your case, Doc. Build your case.
I wish I were there to hear that. It was
Bring us home, Doc.
Right?
Bring us home.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say testimonies. I think that's probably one of
Stories,
the best ways that we can do that. John 4, Woman at the Well, is one of those classic passages that I always think about. Jesus, she has an encounter with Jesus, and then the text says that she went back to the city and told people about essentially her testimony. Then it says Samaritans believe. So it was like your testimony, when you have an encounter with Jesus, your testimony actually furthers the mission of God in a lot of ways, because other people are drawn into what God has done in your life. So I was just saying, one way to tell people about Jesus is to share with them your story, your testimony.
I'd go back to even what Crystal was saying about practice and it being a rhythm. Like almost taking off some weight to be like, it's not going to be right every single time. But again, back to what the author of the Hebrews was saying, he's like, who by way of practice have trained their senses. It's like they've been out there sharing their stories, being intentional, listening, speaking. And sometimes they don't say it right, but then with humility, come back and try again. Right? It's just, it becomes a rhythm and a practice and a regular thing that we do, to where it does then form into something that is more meaningful. I do have a story now. My life is changing, and people see that. It's now, I don't maybe not even have to say as much, because they can just see the difference in the life that I'm living now. Yeah. So it's like, hey, something is different there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Although I do want to sort of say, and make clear, I do think it is important to say something, right?
No, for sure.
That Jesus, I mean, I want to sort of push back against this notion that like, I don't have to say anything about, even say his name or say anything. People just sort of like catch Jesus like a code. Like it doesn't work that way.
No.
Jesus like a code.
In the end of the day, like, our words, we're hopefully by how we speak and how we live, there's things that are showing the message of Jesus, the person of Jesus, and attaching that to that, and that letting people being willing to, I think an important part of rhythm is being willing to tell people, I do buy this. Like I do think 2,000 years ago, a man was born in Palestine, a Jewish man. He lived, died, and he rose again. And I buy that these people saw him for real. And it changed our life. Yeah. And 2,000 plus years later, people continue to follow him and believe in him and have their lives changed.
Yeah.
That sort of, that testimony. And of course, then it's the details of that, right? It's not just that. It's also then, and here's what that means, and here's what it looks like. It's important that we have words that speak to that.
I just wanted to add quickly too, like another side of speak. I know Proverbs 31, like we know that who can find a wife, blah, blah, blah. But before that though, I'm sorry to say blah, blah, blah. But verses 8 and 9, another way that we see God at work, and it talks about speak up for those who have no voice, for the justice of all who
That's
are
good.
Depressed, speak up and judge rightly and defend the cause of the oppressed and
Say
needy.
that.
So I think there's also a way that we can show Christ by how we speak against the injustices and the unrighteousnesses of
Amen.
Yep.
That's good. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and close our time in the Preaching Collective. Continue to like, share, and subscribe. Appreciate y'all. As we always say, love God, love people. We are out. Peace.